Hi, I'm Daniel Likis, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today we're having a Safa Sunday.
Everybody! Hello, hello, hello. I hope you're having a fantastic time zone wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, whether you're watching this live or whether you're watching this later or listening to it on places like Spotify. I hope you have a fantastic day. I hope you're having a fantastic time and you're ready to get into the intricacies of some literature.
Yes, people, thank you so much for tuning in, listening for wherever you are in the world. So, speaking of Miss Burnell, let's shout out our listeners from where? Where do you think we're gonna shout out? Yes.
And so the Judge of Mystic saga is getting much closer to being concluded in the original quartet. So I'm very excited about that. I'm very excited to see these books out and to see what people make of the adventures of Caleb Malthison and his
Yes.
ragtag bunch of people from across different realms. I'm very looking forward to how people view both the battle scenes and the more tender, kind of familial, fun, emotional, fulfilling scenes. So if you like hurt to comfort, and if you like action, and if you like mythology, then definitely the Judge of Mystic Saga is going to be for you. Absolutely.
Yes, people will looking forward for Miss Bernal Guning Agap and
Mhm.
Agape Make. Let's support her somewhat. More books to come. So Miss Bernal, let's shout out our listeners from where?
Woo, Mexico and
Yes.
Thailand and New Zealand. Hello, everybody. Thank you so
Yes.
much for
Thank you so
listening
much.
in Mexico, Thailand, and New Zealand. You are top notch, wonderful, and we heart you greatly. It's
Yes. From the bottom of our heart. And one
Mhm.
more, Miss Bernal. We have one more shout out.
Ooh, we are currently sitting at number 25 in Canada for Geography 101. So, Canada, the true north, strong and free. Hey,
Yes.
thanks so much for
Thank you so much.
listening.
Thank you
Ah,
so much for being our great listeners, Canada. And of course, Miss Berna for Book 101 review on number 7. Where we are
we've
we?
got St. Kitts and Nevis. St. Kitts and Nevis, you have thank you so much for supporting us here at Book 101 Review, not only once, but twice with
Yes.
St. Kitts and Nevis for books and for arts. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you get a lot of value out of all of these incredible author interviews, highlights of different novels, and just stuff about writing good books. And thank you so
Yes.
much to people in Swaziland, Cote d'Ivoire. Oh, epically, epically thank you. Merci beaucoup, Cote d'Ivoire. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much for the bottom of our heart because this podcast is created to empower writers, authors all over the world like me, Safa Bernal. And I'm very grateful for my feature author of the month, Miss Bernal, Mr. Sebastian Di Castel. Thank you so much for sharing your talents to the world for the month of July. I appreciate it and thank you so much. He's a Canadian author. So please do support him because more books to come from him. A
I definitely,
swashbuckling. Yes.
yeah, absolutely. I definitely want to see more Three Musketeers meets high fantasy. Like, let's be honest, Sebastian de Castel, like, if you like swashbuckling and fantasy and like, please, please read those
Yes.
books.
Please do support him. So this coming July, I know this coming August, people, our feature author of the month he is a New York Times best-selling author or New York Times best-selling author, Mr. Aaron Hodge. I will be my author feature of the month, and we have 5 episodes to well to talk with. So, Miss Bernal, what will be our topic for today?
Ooh, we are talking about historical romantic novels. Those lovely little bodice busters that we all know and love. Some people might know and be like, Mm. But, whether it's your thing or not, I hope you enjoy listening to the lovely banter in Book 101 review.
Yes, for sure. So, what defines historical novel, Miss Bernal?
Number one, they are choosing a rich historical context. So you're choosing a specific period in time, sometimes specific events within that period. And you are, highlighting um pardon me, my screen just went a little crazy. uh, all the various social norms and customs and challenges in the time. And so it's just an incredible way to kind of do some world building, which people can actually look at and look at the scholarship themselves. So I think it's almost more high stakes than in a fantasy world build to do historical fiction, because it is, people will look it up. They will take a look at the research for themselves. uh
Yes,
there's also this incredible push for well-developed characters and complexity of character within the historical setting. And I really like that, because you're growing into it, you're kind of growing into that character in their lives. And maybe those obstacles are a little bit different, or maybe those obstacles don't seem like obstacles to you. Um, but to that person in that time period, a well-written historical romance novel will kind of make the case for how difficult those obstacles already are. And so even if it's like, well, nobody does that nowadays, well, I guess I understand that, but you should be able to feel the tension of the time. So I love it for that. And that just leads to emotional depth. It really does. It segues perfectly into it. It slides in and lands, parks perfectly in that parallel spot, in emotional depth, while at the same time giving us a kind of mode of escape. And I think this is really important, especially with what's been going on in the world in the last few years and things like that. I'm not going to get very heavy, but there's a lot of escapism that I think needs to take place. That's my personal opinion. And something like a historical romance novel, something of looking at a different period of time, or looking at a different place, or looking at something where the world is very different than what we see it as today, it can be very refreshing, and it can be incredible to just sort of let go of certain things for a while and enjoy yourself. Make a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, or grab a glass of whatever it is that you enjoy. Grab some biscuits, maybe a little pastry, something, a piece of fruit. Sit down and just luxuriate in this moment in time, and let everything else just be as it is. But you can enjoy this romanticized portrayal of the past, and you can kind of be enchanted for a while by something which reminds us of where we've been, for all
yes,
the good
for
and all
sure.
the ill, but reminds us of where we've been, and then you can kind of see where we're going. So,
Yes, speaking of historical movies, people, because we want to plug in Movie 101 review. We talk about historical romance, and Book 101 review, we're talking about historical novel romance. Right, Miss Bernal? We
oh
want to
yeah.
plug in Movie 101 review. Please do listen and watch us. What we
And
are
find
talking
out.
about there.
Oh yeah. And find out what my favorite historical romance movie of all time actually is. We talk about it in depth. You're going to have to listen to Movie 101 to find out. I'm not going to tell you,
Yes.
but it's my absolute favorite, and I think it might surprise people who've read my work. They're like, "Huh?
What?
Like,
Are you
what?"
sure?
Ah.
So, Miss Bernal, what are your criteria for historical romance accuracy to be well, read for the people? That people will read
So,
it.
historical accuracy in a historical romance novel, for me, are a couple of things. Number one, the way people are wearing clothing and what clothing they're wearing. And it might seem really kind of facetious or sort of surface level to start with clothing, but when you're world building and you're looking back at how this piece of clothing got made, you're seeing what industries people have, what um what kind of technology level they're at. What is their food source? What is their plant source? What is their agricultural situation? If you're in certain places, then you're going to see more silkworms than you are going to see necessarily linen. In other places, you're going to see more leather and more fur than you're going to see something like cotton or hemp. And so when you start with, well, okay, what did they wear? What you're really saying is, what technology did they have access to? What resources did they have access to? What was brought in and imported, and what was natural to the area? Well, all of a sudden you're looking at import export, you're looking at all of these different cultural things and all of these different societal functions. It's incredibly important to the way things go and to what society is like. And for me, I'm a bit of a stickler when it comes to costumes too, when it comes to the way people are wearing clothing in historical romance novels, because I am very personally exhausted by the I'm not like other girls. Um, I don't wear a corset slash pair of bodies slash stays, because most of the period garments would be almost impossible to wear without them, because that was how they were constructed at the time. So maybe it's about understanding more that, guess what? Women didn't just sit on a pillow all day because they had a pair of bodies or a corset on. They were out there doing things, working hard, living life. I'd like people to take a look more at how, the everyday, the farmer's wife, the alewife, the woman who's working in the smithy with her family who have a blacksmith shop. They were all wearing their garments, so if they could do it, I'm pretty sure that your character can too. And it's not, oh no, all the stuff, la la la. So that's number one. I want to see the costumes being treated right. I want to see that kind of being treated in there. Number two, the technology they had around the house. What did that mean? Nowadays I can go into my refrigerator, grab out my cold brew coffee when I remember to refill it. Pour myself a cup of coffee and grab some ice from the door and sit down there with an icy beverage in the morning. It takes me 5 minutes. But in the 1800s, it was almost unheard of to be able to. Where were you going to get that ice? Somebody had to go to a frozen place on the earth and bring it on a ship and hope that enough of it stayed cold that they could sell it into ice boxes. That was an incredibly precious thing. So how did they have their coffee? How did they, make a meal? Where did they get their food? All of that kind of thing too can create situations where you're not just having somebody like, oh yeah, I'll meet you for sandwiches at 5. Well, is that historical to the time period that you're going into? If it's in the 1960s, yeah, it is. You're going over to the malt shop. But if this is in, 1740, and you've got to take a look at where are they getting that food, what are they eating, and how is that food preserved, and different things like that, because then you have a really interesting thing to be able to say, okay, this person is going to the inn, or this person is getting some food made for them, or they are making food in their kitchen. It has taken them this long, and they can have that romantic conversation, or they can have that talk, or they can have that moment in the homestead, in the house. And you can show that historical context while at the same time adding that scene where maybe the gentleman caller or whoever it is like seeing what it is to be a woman of a certain station for the first time. And maybe there's like, oh, there, that realization of we are raised different, or we do have different, tasks upon us depending on who we are in certain time periods. I think those are my two mains, mostly because those ones affect the way people move and work in a scene a little bit more than architecture in a way, because 4 walls or a circular hut or whatever it is, there's a lot of similar architecture over a lot of periods of times. Houses don't change that much if you think about it, but when it comes down to it, how we eat, how we get our food, how we wear clothing, where we get clothing, how much clothing that we have, what it looks like, how you can run in it, how you transport people from one place to another. Those are the things that really modify the presentation of plot in a scene, and there are things which are very easy to get right and wrong. And if you get it wrong, again, people will call you on it. Um, do your research, you know.
Yes, do your research, people. So, Miss Bernal, what are some common challenges in writing historical romance?
Number one, the research. Making sure that you're looking at good scholarship. My personal advice to authors who ask me as an editor, because I'm an author, but I'm also an editor. And yes, I do work for a small press. So this is something that I do on a daily basis in my professional career. Um, where are you getting your research, and how close to primary source is it? There are some incredible primary sources out there. People like Abby Cox are doing an incredible amount of scholarship on dresses of historical periods that we actually still have extant examples of. And so she's able to look at that primary source, which is the garment itself, and say, okay, here's a sweat stain here, here's this here, here's this here. This looks like it was changed out. This looks like it was patched. So what does that mean? And kind of do an investigation on that. That's a primary, like getting to primary source. Also, people who are still alive to tell you what life was like in the 70s. That's a primary source. As we go further and further back in history, we lose those primary sources. You have to get as close to that primary source as possible, because otherwise you're just kind of in the waters of interpretation being, sloshed around by the tide. And so I would say figuring out how to do your research, where to do the research, and where it matters is incredible. And then the second part of that is discerning how much of the world build to keep in and how much of it you just know because it affects how the characters move in your world, but the reader doesn't necessarily have to see it the whole time. Like, the reader doesn't have to see that this woman is making bread every day by showing a chapter and a half of her making bread every day. But they do have to know that she's tired, she's this, she's that, she's got this loaf, she's eating it, it's okay, so she made it. You see it once and then you just kind of go from there. So you have to kind of choose what parts are going to be important from that research. And then you have to frame that research, and you have to frame those historical moments in a way that the modern person will necessarily understand. And if this is somebody like a reader, the ideal reader, like we say, in creating books, you always have an ideal reader when you're doing a commercial project. You're like, okay, this is the kind of person that I think is going to like this book the most. Well, those ideal readers will already have an education in the historical time period. They will already know certain things. They will already know how, the lady got dressed in the morning. They will already know that they were baking bread. There's a whole wealth of information there that they'll know because they've read other novels like this before, that they've been interested in that time period. They've researched it before. And so for that ideal reader, they need a lot less prefacing. They need a lot less kind of bringing in to this historical period than somebody who's like, oh, I heard this is a really good book, but I really don't know anything about it. Well, that person's going to need a little bit more of a helping hand. So you have to kind of gauge, who is this book for? Is this book for people who are, intensely part of that vibe? Or is it for a more general audience where you're kind of bringing them into the fold and bringing them deeper and deeper through that labyrinth? And that's how you decide how precise and how kind of in-depth you're going to be on certain world building moments. For me, as a myth punk author and a cyberpunk author, I don't often write purely historical fiction. Agape Maki is going to be the closest so far, because it takes place in the classical Hellene period and then also in 1863. So there's two timelines going on there. So I'm definitely telling stories, but it also includes gods and goddesses. So, it is also has those fantasy elements. But the way that I've had to approach the same kind of idea is with Norse myth. Obviously, Caleb Malthusson, he is the grandson of Thor. And so Asgard makes an appearance in multiple books, including Book of Revels, Ginnungagap, and onward. And for me, I look at certain concepts in Norse mythology, certain concepts in ancient Scandinavian pre-Christian ways, and various things that we do actually have record of. We don't have a lot of records, so that's the first thing. There's not that many primary sources. But trying to define those things, that for me, growing up hearing these stories on my grandfather's knee, in the region, I know so many things. I'm like, oh yeah, this, that, and the other thing, and then blah blah blah, and then other people that I'm looking at, they're like glazed over. Going, okay, so this is that. So there's 4 parts to like the quote unquote soul, in a lot of Norse myth. There's the Hammer, there's the Hugr, there's the Humming, and they're like, what? And so having to kind of bring in the explanation of what that is very briefly as I'm doing a scene where if Caleb doesn't do something, somebody's going to die. And so, you're like, okay, so yeah, the Hummer, the body. Oh, right. Yeah. Like the Hooger, and so explaining it that way in very small, concise terms, so that people can come along for that ride and come along for that journey where they otherwise might have been a little bit more confused and been like, what are you talking about?
Yay! Very well said, Miss Burnell. And because of that, it's so loud. So, can you name historical romance that is based on a true story?
Ooh. Well, if you want to get into it, there's been a few about Alexander and Hephaestion lately. Those ones have been quite big. I think you get a lot of historical romance novels based around the time period of various kings and queens in English history.
Yes.
So, you've got often tragic historical romances with Henry VIII, that, the other Boleyn girl and things like that, like, it became references for film and things like that. When it comes to actual historical figures, there's so many. Here's a second.
Let's say Queen Elizabeth.
Well,
The first, the
that's
second.
interesting. It's Queen Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I, she definitely, had certain romances of a kind, and there's a lot to write about in her life because it's so nebulous and so incredible. But again, she never married. She
Yes.
stayed the Virgin Queen for a very, very, very long time until the day she died. I think you get a lot of stories about Napoleon Bonaparte and his love affairs. You get lots of novels about Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great
Yes.
and her incredible, incredible story. I would say my favorite of them would probably be The Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory. I did enjoy both the film and the book. And that one, it's a focus on Mary Boleyn, who is the sister of Anne. And if for those of you who are like, oh yes, Anne, right, Anne, yes, Anne Boleyn, the mother of Elizabeth I, who lost her head to her husband. Literally, she was a real scatterbrain right there in the last second. Sorry, that was a really off-color joke, but no, she was killed. She was killed. She was convicted of treason and dispatched.
Yes.
When after Elizabeth was born. So also there's The Invention of Wings by Sue Monk Kidd, and that is a 19th century book about an abolitionist, Sarah Grimke. And that one has some intriguing themes in it as well. Lots of socially justice kind of themes, love, things like that. Sarah Grimke is a fascinating figure when you look back. There are plenty of books written about Elizabeth I, about the Virgin Queen. especially, with Robert Dudley and various figures. And, it gets a little intriguing. I, I think too, there's almost more, almost fantasy like fictions about certain characters, like Cleopatra in history. How many, you know, novelizations has there been about the story of Cleopatra? There's been so many that I would hate to mention just one, uh, without being like, oh, sorry, I missed the other 72, that are really good. Going back all the way to Shakespeare, you've got Antony and Cleopatra, and how many motifs were built off of that Shakespeare play that have kind of created a mythology of Cleopatra, beyond what we know of her, as a historical figure, as a Macedonian, Greek living in Egypt, potentially with a little bit of other things in there. But I think for me, I would say, the oldie and goodie is Philippa Gregory's The Other Berlin Girl.
Mm, I agree.
That was really good.
So, Miss Brenner, what impact do historical novels have on the preservation and understanding of history?
They certainly grip people. They certainly grip people and have them, hopefully, if the novel is good, if the setting is compelling, if the stories and that the characters are going through are complex, if there's emotional depth in there, then I believe that historical fiction and historical romances can do a very good job of getting people interested in, uh, reading more history, in watching a documentary or two, figuring out what's going on in that time period of the world, being interested in the other stories around it. So I think that it's sort of a gateway into a study of history. And it doesn't need to be an academic study. It could be, a fun documentary or two and that kind of thing. But I do believe that if the setting is just on point and everything else of the book is on point, then people will be more interested in reading more about that time. And that can do a tremendous amount of good to remind people of our past before we lose it. Because let's be honest, it takes 2 generations to lose knowledge. And then that knowledge is gone. You can't necessarily get it back. And archaeology is a great thing. And we can look back and try and piece things together, but we don't know how those things worked. We don't know the intricacies of the Sutton Hoo helmet and what it actually meant and whether or not it was an Odin mask. There are certain things that are always going to be lost. So I think that this is a fun way to remind people to look back and to think about those old food traditions and the old, way that people used to make clothes, and various things that we used to have, various technologies that we used to use that are now very, very outdated, but we still need to know they existed. We still need to know where certain other technology came from. And one way to do that is by telling interesting, intriguing, sometimes romantic and fantastic stories in those times, and keep people interested in what life was like then.
Yes, for sure, Miss Ben. Also, how do historical novels or romance portray cultural or societal norms of the past,
Ooh, well, um,
like their costumes?
yes. So we talked about the costumes, which are again very important, because in most places that I've seen, um, and I'm talking everywhere from my forays in West Africa all the way to various Asian countries, all the way to Europe and North America, but mostly, various places throughout history. Um, there were sumptuary laws. There were cultural conventions that if you were of a certain status, if you were of a certain societal shelf, there were certain things that you were and were not allowed to wear. And so that helped define your place in society. And if somebody was wearing something that was beyond or below their station, that was actually shocking, you know. And you think too, this isn't just a Eurocentric idea. This also happened in the Heian era of Japan. This also happens in various West African societies with things like kente cloth in West Africa. Um, the various patterns of kente cloth can be worn by various people. Certain patterns of kente cloth are reserved for royalty. They are reserved for nana, the chief, the king. you know, they are, kept back. And so you have to earn certain cloth and certain woven patterns and things like that. So it can do, a lot of shock and awe if all of a sudden somebody goes walking out there in something that they haven't earned, or if they're walking out there in something that's beyond them, or underneath them, because where somebody fit within the status of a culture has been historically incredibly important. And it can be shocking when we think of things today, especially in our North American society, where it's more about democracy and equality. And, we don't have necessarily the same striations of culture in the same way. At least we don't think we do in certain cases. But I think, too, but outside of clothing, outside of various other things like transportation, whether or not somebody had a horse, whether or not they were, using their oxen to go to market. If we're talking, Tudor era England, then most more common people did not have horses. They used oxen. Those are cows. Like they use their oxen to pull their plow and do everything that, they'd have a pair of oxen. So are you going into town with a cart to sell vegetables with oxen, or are you kind of trotting by on a horse, or, how are you getting places? That too can kind of show the cultural divide. Whether or not you're a part of certain religious organizations, that too can show a lot of divide and a lot of, union between different peoples, and create a lot of conflict, especially if it's a forbidden romance story where, say, somebody is part of the clergy and they fall in love. Well, that is going to be a very forbidden romance. Unless your name is Borgia, pardon me. Look at the history, people. Wait, there's a lot of stories you can tell. I think too, I look at women and the roles of women. Obviously, I am one, so I do have somewhat of a natural authority to speak about the roles of women. But two, what was the role of that specific female character? Was she sitting on a dainty little chair learning how to be a proper lady so she could get married someday to some minor lord? Or did she have her sleeves rolled up and was, hammering iron to make nails in her parents' blacksmithy? And blacksmiths' wives made nails. They actually helped with all of the things that a blacksmith would do. Same thing with potters and carpenters and a whole bunch of, alewives and a whole bunch of different functions. I mean, yes, carpenters had guilds. So when you get into guilds, then you kind of separate from women. But, if somebody came from just the village, they're not just sitting there all day doing embroidery, waiting for their prince to come. They're working hard. They're, helping with the other, with their siblings. They're making meals, they're baking bread, they're cleaning. Laundry took a week. Laundry was a huge circumstance that would take a lot of time. What they filled their time with depended on the technology of that period. And so that too can bring in senses of conflict, senses of, adventure and things like that. And yeah, I could see a lot of women being like, you know what, I don't want to work this hard. It's like, well, good luck, because who doesn't work that hard? Around
Everybody.
you, it's like, oh, but I wish I could be like those girls on those pillows doing embroidery all day. And,
Mm.
and it's like, do you really? Because they don't really, I don't know. It's it. I think those are massive ways that you can kind of see the conflict of the period, and you can kind of see that sort of cultural reverence and irreverence depending on how the character handles it. Just by everyone's sake, please, please, please don't just make your female characters not like other girls.
Yes.
Mhm.
Boys.
look at what all of the other
Elegance.
women were doing in that time period, and you will probably find that, you know what, being a brewmaster, as we would know it today, like making a whole bunch of ale and different beers and things like that is a lot of work, but it was also for a lot of periods of time women's work. So I mean, come on, have fun with that, have fun with that fact, and go from there.
Yes, let's empower women all over the world.
Mhm.
People, because they contribute many, many things to make this world go round. So, Miss Bernal, before we go on, I want to invite you. Please do listen to my other podcast, Music 101, on our second season with my new co host, Mr. Mika Smith. And please do listen to our latest episode. We talk about one of these legendary anthology story of Mr. Chipmunk. So please do listen. Music 101 on our new season. So Miss Bernal, please do plug in your books. We are looking forward for Ginang Gagap and Agape Make.
All right, everybody. So as I said, I am a cyberpunk and mythpunk author. I also write poetry. If you are interested in novels which have a very big emotional bent, while at the same time having lots of action and everything from weird motherly AI all the way to different gods and goddesses from various mythologies in the world, I think you would really like my books. You can go on my website, saphaburnell.com, and read the first chapter of all my books, so you can see whether or not my style and my form of words really interests you. You can also go onto my Substack, which is usurperkings.substack.com, and read the first chapter of all my novels there and get more of a reflection on what I do, what I think, and what's coming up the gangplank. I am so excited to finish off the Judge of Mystics saga. It's so much closer now, and I'm very much looking forward to Gunungagap being that explosive finale, and then getting on to Agape Maki, which is a prequel origin story with lots of historical romance in it, because it's about Ares and Aphrodite in the classical Grecian period, and I'm really excited.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Safa Bernal because she's a supporter. More books to come. So, Miss Bernal, thank you for your time.
And thank you for yours. I hope you have a fantastic week.
More to come, people. See you soon. So, Miss Bernal,